I never imagined that sitting in our living room on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the very house where I had spent 32 years of my life would become a battlefield. The aroma of fresh-baked cookies still lingered in the air as my 3 children, Sharon, David, and Jennifer, sat across from me with clipboards and calculators, treating my home like nothing more than a real estate transaction. Their father, Robert, had only been gone 6 months, and here they were, already planning to cash out. The family legacy he and I had built together brick by brick, memory by memory. "Mom, you have to be reasonable," Sharon said, her voice carrying that same patronizing tone she used when discussing retirement homes for her in-laws. "This house is far too big for just you. The maintenance alone is draining your savings." I watched as David, my middle child, nodded in agreement, his expensive suit making him look more like a stranger than the boy who used to build forts under our dining room table. "The market's hot right now, Mom. We've already talked to Michael Davis. He thinks we could get at least $400,000. You could move into that nice senior community near the lake." Jennifer, my youngest, fidgeted with her phone, barely looking up. "Plus, it's just practical. You don't need 4 bedrooms and 2 stories anymore." I sat there, stirring my lukewarm tea, listening to them dissect my life as if I weren't in the room. They spoke in numbers and practicalities, never once mentioning how Dad had installed those hardwood floors himself, working weekend after weekend until his hands were raw. They didn't remember the kitchen renovation we'd saved 5 years for, or how the upstairs bathroom was painted 3 times because I couldn't decide between seafoam green and lavender. To them, this was just property. To me, it was everything. But I kept quiet. Not because I was defeated, not because I agreed with them, but because I had a plan they would never see coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn leaves crunched under my feet as I walked down Maple Street the next morning, my coffee steaming in the crisp October air. Cedar Falls had always been a town where neighbors knew each other's names, where the mailman stopped to chat, and where secrets traveled faster than gossip at the Sunday service. But lately, I'd been keeping a secret of my own, one that had been germinating since the day Robert passed away. Helena Clark, my neighbor of 20 years, waved from her garden, where she was planting the last of her fall bulbs. "Morning, Maggie. How are you holding up?" I paused at her fence, grateful for the genuine concern in her voice. Helena had been my closest friend through Robert's illness, sitting with me during those long hospital visits, bringing casseroles when I forgot to eat, holding my hand when words weren't enough. "They want to sell the house," I told her simply, watching as her weathered hands stopped mid-motion. "Who wants to sell? Your children?" Her eyes widened with disbelief. "But Maggie, that house is your life. You and Robert built that place from the ground up?" I nodded, taking a long sip of coffee. According to them, it's too big, too expensive, too much for an old widow to handle. The bitterness in my voice surprised even me. Helena stood up, brushing dirt from her gardening gloves. "And what did you tell them?" A smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. "Nothing yet, but I have plans of my own." The truth was, I'd been thinking about those plans for months. During Robert's final weeks, when he was still lucid enough to whisper his dreams for our house, he'd taken my hand and said, "Maggie, this place has so much love in its walls. Don't let it become just another commodity." Those words had haunted me ever since. That afternoon, I visited the Cedar Falls Community Center. Dr. Samuel Chen, the director, greeted me with his characteristic warmth. Samuel had known Robert and me for years. We'd volunteered at the center's annual fundraisers, helped serve Thanksgiving dinners to families in need, and watched as the center struggled to maintain its programs due to budget cuts. "Mrs. Thompson," Samuel said, gesturing to a chair in his modest office, "what brings you here today?" I sat down, clutching my purse. "I want to talk to you about a partnership, Samuel. between my house and the community center. His eyebrows rose with curiosity. I'm listening. Over the next hour, I laid out my vision. The house on Maple Street wasn't just going to be sold to the highest bidder and forgotten. It was going to become something Robert and I had always dreamed about, a place that gave back to the community. The upstairs could be converted into affordable temporary housing for families in transition. The spacious basement could serve as a workshop space for job training programs. The beautiful backyard could host community gardens and children's activities. But Mrs. Thompson, Samuel leaned forward, his expression both excited and concerned. This is an incredible offer, but the logistics, your children, surely they have expectations. I smiled, the same smile I'd given Helena that morning. Let me worry about my children, Samuel. What I need to know is whether the community center can legally accept such a property donation and whether you have the resources to maintain it. Samuel's eyes lit up. If you're serious about this, Maggie, I can put you in touch with our board of directors and our legal counsel. This could change everything for so many families in Cedar Falls. As I walked home that day, something felt different. The weight of grief was still there. It probably always would be. But alongside it was something else. Purpose. For 6 months, I'd been drifting through days, letting my children make decisions about my life while I sat quietly, stirring tea and nodding. Not anymore. That evening, Sharon called. Mom, we've scheduled another meeting for Sunday. Michael Davis will be there with the paperwork. We really need to move forward with this. I'll be there, I replied, my voice steady. I have something to discuss with you all as well. Great. I'm glad you're finally being reasonable about this. After hanging up, I sat in Robert's favorite chair, running my fingers over the worn armrest. The house was quiet, but not empty. I could feel him here, in the creaks of the floorboards, in the way the afternoon light filtered through the living room windows. This wasn't just about keeping a house. It was about honoring what we'd built together and extending that legacy into something meaningful. Over the next few days, I met with lawyers, city planners, and board members. The more I delved into the possibility of converting our home into a community resource, the more feasible it became. The basement already had separate access. Robert had installed that door years ago when he thought about renting it out for extra income. The upstairs bedrooms were spacious and could easily be adapted into small apartment units. Even the large garage could be converted into a classroom space. Emma Rodriguez, who owned the local hardware store, caught wind of my plans through the community center grapevine. She stopped by on Thursday afternoon with a box of sample tiles and paint swatches. Maggie, she said, spreading them across my kitchen table, if you're really doing this, I want to help. I've got contractors who owe me favors, suppliers who could donate materials. This community has taken care of my family for years. It's about time we gave something back. I touched the smooth ceramic tiles, imagining them in a newly renovated kitchen where families would share meals, where job training workshops would take place. Emma, I haven't even told my children yet. This might all fall through. She patted my hand. Something tells me it won't. You've got that look in your eyes, the same one Robert had when he was determined to make something happen. Friday morning, I found Jennifer on my doorstep, holding a stack of senior living brochures. Mom, I took the liberty of researching some options for you. This one has a waiting list, but David knows someone on the board. I invited her in, noticing how she glanced around the familiar rooms with an appraiser's eye rather than the warmth of someone who'd grown up here. As she sat at our kitchen table, the same table where I'd packed her school lunches, helped with homework, celebrated birthdays, I realized how disconnected she'd become from the house's history. Jen, I said softly, do you remember the Christmas? When you were 8? When the pipes froze and we had to stay in the living room with space heaters? She paused mid-sentence, a slight frown creasing her forehead. Vaguely. Why? Your father spent 3 days fixing those pipes himself. We didn't have money for a plumber, but he was determined to get the heat working before Santa came. You and David built that massive blanket fort, and Sharon taught us all how to make hot chocolate from scratch because the power kept going out. Jennifer's expression softened slightly. I remember the blanket fort. This house holds 32 years of memories like that, sweetheart. Every scratch on the floor, every paint chip on the walls, they all tell stories of our life here. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Mom, I know this is hard, but those are just memories. You can make new ones anywhere. And honestly, wouldn't it be easier for you? No more worrying about the furnace or the roof or the plumbing? I squeezed back, noting the practiced gentleness in her voice, the way she was handling me like something fragile that might break if she spoke too loudly or moved too quickly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That's when I knew for certain that my children had already decided my future. They weren't asking for my input. They were managing me. Saturday brought an unexpected visitor. Michael Davis, the real estate agent, knocked on my door with an eager smile and a folder thick with documents. Mrs. Thompson, he said smoothly, I know our official meeting isn't until tomorrow, but I wanted to give you these listing papers in advance. Your children thought you might want time to review them privately before signing. I accepted the folder, feeling its weight. They're moving quite quickly, aren't they? Well, the market is hot. And honestly, a house like this in your neighborhood? It'll be gone within a week of listing. Multiple offers, I'm sure. Your children are smart to move fast. After he left, I sat alone with the papers spread before me. Listing price, $425,000. Commission fees, closing costs, inspector recommendations, all laid out neatly, reducing our family home to a series of financial calculations. There was even a suggested timeline: list by next Friday, first showings the following week, closing by month's end. I thought about the phone call I'd received that morning from Samuel Chen. The community center's board had voted unanimously to accept my proposal, pending my children's agreement and legal formalities. The city zoning office had already indicated that the property met requirements for multi-use community space. Local businesses had started pledging resources and volunteer hours. Everything was falling into place, except for one crucial element: my children. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking about what Robert would say if he were here. He'd had such faith in our children, always believing they'd grown into the values we'd tried to instill: compassion, community spirit, the understanding that home meant more than 4 walls and a roof. But somewhere along the way, between their mortgages and career pressures and suburban lifestyles, they'd lost touch with what we'd built here. Sunday morning arrived crisp and clear. I dressed carefully in my best blue dress, the one Robert always said brought out my eyes, and made coffee for everyone. By 10 o'clock, they were all assembled in my living room. Sharon with her clipboard, David with his calculator, Jennifer with her phone, and Michael Davis with his briefcase full of contracts. "Mom," Sharon began, taking control of the meeting, as she always did. "We've made this as simple as possible for you. Michael has everything prepared. All you need to do is sign and we'll handle the rest." "The house could be on the market by Friday," David added. "We've even started looking at moving companies for you." Jennifer held up her phone. "And Mom, I've narrowed down your senior community options to 3 finalists. We can schedule tours this week." They all looked at me expectantly, their faces a mix of patience and determination. Michael Davis poised his pen over the contract, ready to witness my signature. I took a deep breath, looking at each of my children's faces. These were the babies I'd rocked to sleep, the toddlers who'd taken their first steps on these very floors, the teenagers who'd slammed doors and shouted that they hated me before hugging me goodnight. When had they become strangers who spoke to me in bullet points and financial projections? "Before I sign anything," I said quietly, "I need to tell you something." Sharon glanced at her watch. Of course, Mom, but the market timing is really important. I'm not selling the house, I interrupted. The room fell silent. David lowered his calculator. Jennifer's thumb paused mid-scroll on her phone. Michael Davis's pen hovered awkwardly in the air. I'm sorry. Sharon's voice held a note of disbelief, as if she'd misheard. I said I'm not selling the house, I repeated, my voice growing stronger. At least, not the way you're planning. Jennifer leaned forward. Mom, we've been through this. You can't maintain this place alone. It's too much. You're right, I said, surprising them. It is too much for one person. That's why I'm not keeping it for just me. I reached into my cardigan pocket and pulled out the papers Samuel had given me. 3 days ago, I formally proposed to donate this house to the Cedar Falls Community Center. The proposal was accepted yesterday morning. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael Davis slowly lowered his pen. Sharon's clipboard slipped from her lap. David's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, surprise, and something that looked like irritation. You're donating our childhood home to strangers? Jennifer finally managed. Not strangers, I corrected gently. Community. The upstairs will provide temporary housing for families in transition. The basement will become a job training center. We'll use the garage for educational programs and the backyard for community gardens. Sharon found her voice first, and it was tight with controlled anger. Mother, you can't make a decision like this without consulting us. This is a family asset. This is my home, I said firmly, but not unkindly. Your father and I built it together, and I have every legal right to decide its future. I've consulted lawyers, city planners, and the community center's board. Everything is in order. David rubbed his temples. Mom, do you have any idea what you're giving away? $400,000 just gone? Gone where? I challenged. Into whose pockets? Yours? Mine? To buy another house in another state where I can sit alone and wait for occasional phone calls and obligatory holiday visits? I stood up, surprising myself with the steadiness of my movements. This house means something. It can continue to mean something. It can help families get back on their feet, teach skills to people who need them, bring neighbors together. Michael. Davis cleared his throat awkwardly. Mrs. Thompson, while I admire your philanthropic spirit, I'm afraid you might be making an emotional decision. The financial implications. Michael, I interrupted, I think it's time for you to leave. This is a family matter now. He gathered his papers quickly, mumbling something about keeping the offers open, but I barely heard him. My attention was on my children, watching them process what I'd just revealed. Sharon was the first to recover, and her response was typical. Mother, we're concerned about you. This kind of drastic decision-making. Perhaps we should talk to your doctor about your state of mind. A laugh escaped me, not bitter, but genuine. My state of mind is clearer than it's been in months, sweetheart. For the first time since your father died, I'm making a decision based on what I want, not what everyone else thinks I should do. But Mom, Jennifer said, her voice softer now, what about your future, your security? I sat back down, looking at each of them in turn. Let me tell you about my future. I'm going to live in the small apartment they're converting on the main floor. I'll help coordinate the community programs, manage the gardens, be there when families need someone to talk to. I'll have more purpose and community than I've had since your father died. David leaned back in his chair, disbelief still written across his face. You're going to be a landlord at your age? I'm going to be useful, I corrected. I'm going to wake up every morning in the house I love, surrounded by people, doing work that matters. Does that sound so terrible to you? The room fell. Quiet again. But this time it was a different kind of silence. I could see them trying to reconcile their image of me, the grieving widow who needed their protection and guidance. with this person sitting before them who had orchestrated an entire plan without their knowledge or permission. Sharon finally spoke, her voice carefully measured. "How long have you been planning this?" "Since the day I listened to you three. Discuss selling this house like it was nothing more than a stock portfolio that needed liquidating," I answered honestly, "since I realized you see me as another asset to be managed, not a person capable of making her own choices." "That's not fair," David protested. "We were trying to help. You thought I needed saving," I finished for him. "From my grief, from my house, from my life. But what I needed was for someone to ask me what I wanted, not tell me what was best for me." Jennifer had tears in her eyes now. "We do care about you, Mom. We're just worried." "I know you care," I said softly. "And I know you're worried. But caring doesn't mean making decisions for someone. Worrying doesn't mean taking away their autonomy. I've lost my husband, not my mind." The afternoon sun was slanting through the windows now, casting long shadows across the familiar room. I thought about all the Sunday afternoons we'd spent here as a family, reading newspapers, playing board games, arguing about politics. When had we stopped really seeing each other? Sharon straightened her papers with shaky hands. "So what happens? Now?" "Now," I said. "You decide whether you can support my choice, even if you don't agree with it. The community center is drawing up the legal documents. There will be tax benefits, and I'm keeping a small portion of the equity for myself. Everything else goes into the property and programs." "What if it doesn't work?" David asked. "What if the community center can't maintain it? What if it does work?" I interrupted gently. "What if it becomes exactly what your father and I always hoped it could be? A place that gives families a chance to rebuild, that brings people together, that makes a difference in our community?" The room was silent for a long moment. Finally, Jennifer wiped her eyes. "I remember that Christmas you mentioned yesterday, with the frozen pipes. Dad made it into an adventure. We roasted marshmallows over the space heater and told ghost stories. He painted my room 3 different shades of pink before I was happy with it," Sharon added quietly. "He said good enough wasn't good enough when it came to his princess." David smiled slightly. "He taught me how to fix the garbage disposal when I was 12. Said every person needed to know how things worked, not just how to use them." I felt my own eyes welling up. He loved this house because it gave him a place to build things, not just walls and rooms, but memories and moments with you three. That's what I'm trying to honor. The silence that followed was different now. Not uncomfortable or angry, but thoughtful. Gradually, I saw understanding dawn on their faces. Not complete agreement, perhaps, but recognition of what I was trying to do and why it mattered. Sharon closed her clipboard without writing anything down. "Can we see the plans? The real plans, not just... Can you show us what you envision?" I smiled, relief flowing through me. "I'd love to." Over the next hour, I spread out the architectural drawings, the community center's proposal, the letters of support from local businesses. I watched as my children transformed from real estate agents to the curious, engaged people they used to be. David calculated the practical aspects with genuine interest rather than opposition. Jennifer started making suggestions about community outreach and social media. Sharon, ever the organizer, began outlining implementation timelines and volunteer coordination strategies. "The basement really is perfect for workshops," David mused, examining the blueprints. "Dad always said it had good bones. And this space could work for childcare during training sessions?" Jennifer added, pointing to the former playroom. "So parents don't have to find babysitters." Sharon looked up from the spreadsheets, a familiar spark in her eyes. "Mom, do you realize what kind of tax documentation we'll need for this? The community partnerships alone will require quarterly reporting. You'll need help managing all this." "I was hoping you might help with that," I admitted. For the first time, that Sharon smiled. Really smiled? Of course I will. Someone needs to make sure you don't let the bureaucracy overwhelm you. As the afternoon wore on, something shifted in the room. We weren't sitting across from each other anymore, adversaries in a negotiation. We were family again, working together on something bigger than any of us. The tension that had filled the room when they arrived, the assumption that I needed to be managed, was replaced by the recognition that I needed to be heard. By the time they left that evening, we had a completely different plan than the one they'd arrived with. Instead of selling the house to strangers, we were transforming it into something that would keep our family's legacy alive in the community. The children would help with different aspects. Sharon with administration, David with maintenance and renovations, Jennifer with community programming and outreach. But before they went, Sharon paused at the door. "Mom," she said, "I owe you an apology. We came in here today assuming you couldn't handle things on your own. We thought we were protecting you, but really, you were protecting yourselves," I finished gently. "From seeing me as anything other than someone who needed taking care of. It's okay. Grief makes us all a little lost." She hugged me then, and it wasn't the careful, conditional hug I'd gotten used to. It was real and tight, and reminded me of all the times she'd sought comfort in my embrace. "I'm proud of you, Mom. Dad would be too." David joined the hug, and then Jennifer, until we were all holding each other in the entryway of the house that would soon belong to us all in a completely different way. After they left, I walked through each room slowly, no longer seeing them through the lens of loss or the anxiety of letting go. Instead, I imagined them filled with new life, new stories, new memories. The kitchen where I'd taught my children to bake would teach job skills to adults re-entering the workforce. The living room where we'd gathered for holidays would host community meetings and support groups. The bedrooms where my children had grown up would shelter families as they rebuilt their lives. That night, I sat in Robert's chair again, but this time it felt different. The house wasn't holding me back in grief. It was propelling me forward into something meaningful. I could almost hear his voice saying, "Now that's more like it, Maggie. That's the woman I fell in love with." The phone rang just as I was getting ready for bed. It was Samuel Chen calling from the community center. "Maggie," he said, his voice warm with excitement. "I just heard from the city council. They want to feature your story in the monthly newsletter. They're calling it Community First, when individual action creates collective change." I smiled into the phone. "That's very nice, Samuel, but let's make sure they spell it right. This isn't about me. It's about what happens when we remember that our homes, our resources, our lives are all more meaningful when they're shared." "Absolutely," he agreed. "But Maggie, thank you. You've started something here that's going to ripple through this community for years to come." After I hung up, I opened the windows to let in the cool autumn air. The house felt different already, not emptier, but somehow more spacious, as if it were stretching its walls in anticipation of all the life it would soon contain. I thought about tomorrow, when I'd start the paperwork officially transferring the deed. I thought about next month, when the renovations would begin. I thought about next year, when families would be living here, learning here, growing here. But mostly, I thought about today, about the moment when I stopped being a passive participant in my own life and became an active agent of change. About the look in my children's eyes when they realized I wasn't the grieving widow they needed to manage, but the strong woman who had raised them. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I paused in the hallway. The family photos still lined the walls, birthday parties, graduations, everyday moments frozen in time. But now, I could see past the nostalgia to the future. These walls would soon hold new photos, new memories, new stories of families finding their footing, of community members coming together, of a house that continued to shelter and nurture long after its original family had grown and scattered. In my bedroom, the room that would soon become part of a family transitional housing unit. I sat at the window and looked out over the backyard. Tomorrow, I'd meet with Emma Rodriguez about the community garden plans. Next week, I'd help interview the first program coordinator. Next month, I'd move into my new apartment downstairs and welcome the first families who needed a safe place to start over. The last 6 months had been about learning to live with loss. The next 6 months, and all the months to follow, would be about learning to live with purpose. I pulled out the letter Robert had written to me during his final days, the one I'd kept in my nightstand, reading it whenever I felt too alone or too uncertain. "Maggie, my love," it read, "by the time you read this, I'll be gone. But I want you to know that our life together was perfect, not because it was easy, but because we faced everything together. Now you'll face things alone, and I know that scares you. But you're stronger than you know, more creative than you give yourself credit for, and more loved than you might feel. Don't just survive without me, Maggie. Live, build, create. Make our house, our life, mean something beyond just us. I'll be cheering you on." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the drawer. Tomorrow, I'd frame it and hang it in the community center's main room, where families could read it and know that love doesn't end with death. It transforms, it inspires, it continues. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs, but tonight they sounded different. Not like the sounds of aging and entropy, but like a building taking a deep breath before embarking on its next chapter. In the morning, I'd wake up in this house for the last time as its sole owner. But I'd wake up as something more than a widow holding on to the past. I'd wake up as a woman who had found a way to turn private grief into public good, who had learned that home isn't just where you live, but what you do with it, and who had finally answered her children's plans with a better one they never expected. The last thought I had before drifting off to sleep was a simple one. Sometimes the most radical act of self-care is refusing to be cared for on someone else's terms. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give your family is showing them that you're still capable of surprising them. And sometimes the best way to honor the past is to imagine and create a better future. Tomorrow, everything would change. And for the first time in 6 months, I could hardly wait. The next morning started earlier than I'd experienced in months. I woke at sunrise not from habit, but from anticipation. There's something transformative about watching the first light of day creep across a house you're about to change completely. I stood at my bedroom window, coffee mug warming my hands, watching Cedar Falls wake up while my mind raced through everything that would happen today. Helena was already in her garden, probably hoping to catch me before I left for the community center. She gave me a knowing wave. Word had already traveled through the neighborhood about yesterday's events. That's the thing about small towns. News moves faster than light, especially news that challenges expectations. By 8 o'clock, I was sitting in Samuel Chen's office, surrounded by papers that would make yesterday's meeting with Michael Davis look simple. Property law, tax implications, zoning requirements, liability concerns. Each document represented another step away from the life my children had planned for me and toward something entirely different. "Mrs. Thompson," said Maria Gonzalez, the community center's legal advisor, adjusting her glasses as she reviewed the donation agreement, "I want to make sure you understand the implications fully. Once these papers are signed, the property transfers to a community trust. You'll maintain your apartment and a small equity share, but the house itself will belong to the community." I nodded, my pen hovering over the signature line. "I understand completely. That's exactly what I want." Samuel leaned forward, his expression gentle but serious. "Maggie, are you absolutely certain your children are on board with this? The last thing we want is family conflict to undermine what we're trying to build here." A smile tugged at my lips as I remembered last night's phone call. Sharon had contacted me around 10, her voice different than it had been during our meeting. Lighter, more engaged. "Mom," she'd said, I spent the evening talking with David and Jen. We want you to know we support you completely. Actually, I think we're a little in awe of you. They'll be fine, I told Samuel, signing the first document. In fact, they're planning to help. Sharon's already drafting a volunteer coordinator framework. What I didn't mention was the text I'd received from Jennifer at midnight. Mom, I couldn't sleep thinking about how you've been planning this alone. I'm sorry we tried to box you into our idea of safety. Can I help with the social media campaign for the house? Or David's early morning email proposing a maintenance schedule he could manage between his regular job hours. As I worked through the legal documents, my phone kept buzzing with messages. The community response had begun almost immediately after word spread about the donation. Local businesses were offering everything from painting services to landscaping supplies. The high school's carpentry class wanted to help with the renovations as a semester project. Even the mayor's office had reached out about potential grants for community housing initiatives. This is unprecedented, Maria murmured, reading through the list of pledged resources. I've never seen this kind of immediate community engagement for a private property conversion. By noon, I was exhausted but exhilarated. The legal framework was in place, the community center had officially accepted the donation, and the city had fast-tracked the zoning change permits. What had started as a quiet rebellion against my children's plans had become something much larger. Emma Rodriguez met me at the diner for lunch, sliding into the booth across from me with blueprints and fabric samples. Maggie, I've been up all night thinking about this project. The hardware store's supplier offered a 40% discount on all materials for the renovation. And I talked to my brother. He's a contractor in Minneapolis. He says this kind of adaptive reuse is becoming a model for small communities everywhere. I picked at my chicken salad, overwhelmed by the momentum building around my decision. Emma, I just wanted to keep my house from becoming another flip property. I never expected all this. She reached across to squeeze my hand. That's exactly why it's working. You didn't do this for attention or praise. You did it because you saw a need and had a solution. That kind of authenticity, it's infectious. After lunch, I drove home slowly through downtown Cedar Falls, seeing it with new eyes. The empty storefront next to the library could partner with our job training programs. The community garden behind the church could expand into our backyard. Space. The struggling youth center across from the post office might find new life through collaboration with our family support services. At home, I found a box on my porch. No card, just a collection of hand-drawn pictures from the children. In Mrs. Patterson's 4th grade class, they'd heard about this sharing house and wanted to contribute ideas. One drawing showed stick figures holding hands around a massive house with flowers everywhere. Another depicted children playing while adults were in little boxes labeled learning. I was still looking through the drawings when the doorbell rang. Mrs. Miller, my elderly neighbor from 3 houses down, stood on my porch with a covered casserole dish and tears in her eyes. Margaret, she said, her voice wavering, I lost my Harold 6 years ago. I know what you're going through, letting go of the house you built together. When I heard what you're doing, I want to help. Harold always said this neighborhood took care of its own. This is how we do it. I invited her in, and over tea and her famous tuna noodle casserole, she told me about the hidden network of support she'd discovered in her own grief. The neighbors who shoveled her walk without being asked. The church ladies who brought groceries when she couldn't face the store. The retired mailman who checked on her every Tuesday. Your house becoming a community center, she said, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. It just makes official what we've been doing informally. And maybe some of us older folks won't feel so alone anymore. By late afternoon, I was back at the house, walking through each room with a notebook, planning the changes. The formal dining room could become a classroom. The sun porch would be perfect for counseling sessions or quiet study. Even the small room Robert had used as his workshop could serve as a skills training space. My phone rang. David calling. From his office in Minneapolis. Mom, he said, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. I've been thinking about the financial aspects all day. I know we talked about this, but I want to make sure you really understand what you're giving up. The market value, the inheritance implications for us kids. I settled into Robert's favorite chair, feeling a familiar patience wash over me. David, sweetheart, do you remember when you were 12 and you wanted to donate all your Christmas presents to the shelter? A pause. Yeah. Your father and I could have talked you out of it, explained why keeping your new bike made more financial sense. But instead, we helped you organize the donation. Do you remember why? Another pause. Longer this time. Because some things matter more than money. Exactly. And you learned something that day about value that can't be calculated in spreadsheets. I'm learning the same thing now, and I'm teaching it to you 3 all over again. He was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about taking some vacation days to help with the renovations. My boss actually suggested it. Apparently, he grew up in a house converted to a community space in Pittsburgh. Said it changed his whole perspective on what home means. After we hung up, I continued my walkthrough. But now I wasn't alone. I could hear voices outside, neighbors gathering, discussing, planning. Through the kitchen window, I saw Helena setting up a folding table in my backyard. More people were arriving, bringing chairs, notebooks, ideas. I stepped outside to find an impromptu planning meeting happening on my lawn. The high school principal was there, talking with the community college's career counselor. Local business owners were clustered around Helena's table, sketching workshop ideas on napkins. Even Mrs. Patterson's 4th graders were there, having walked over after school, armed with more drawings and endless energy. "Maggie!" Helena called out when she spotted me. "We hope you don't mind." Word spread about tonight's planning session, and well, people got excited. I looked around at the 20 or so neighbors who had gathered on my lawn. These were people I'd known for decades. Some I'd only nodded to in passing. Others who had shared countless neighborhood barbecues and snow emergencies. They were all here, united by a shared vision for what my house could become. "I don't mind at all," I said truthfully. "This is exactly what I hoped would happen." Sarah Jenkins, the elementary school counselor, approached with a folder full of research papers. "Maggie, I've been looking into other communities that have tried this model. There's a place in Vermont that converted a mansion into transitional housing and job training. They've helped over 200 families get back on their feet in 5 years." While she talked, I noticed Jennifer's car pulling up to the curb. She got out, looking surprised at the crowd, then spotted me and broke into a wide grin. She'd changed out of her work clothes and was carrying a box of poster board and markers. "Mom," she called out, making her way through the gathering. "I thought you might want help visualizing the community rooms. I brought some design supplies." The next hour flew by in a blur of conversations, ideas, and tentative plans taking shape. Jennifer set up a design station where people could sketch their vision for different rooms. The pastor from First Methodist suggested forming committees for different aspects of the project. The owner of the art supply store proposed a mural project for the exterior walls, painted by local youth. Just before sunset, Sharon arrived looking professionally disheveled, her laptop bag in one hand and a stack of binders in the other. She'd been working all afternoon on grants applications and volunteer coordination systems, she announced, and several local foundations had already expressed interest in supporting the project. "Also," she added, looking directly at me with something that might have been pride, "I filed for nonprofit status for Thompson House Community Center. We should have it approved within 60 days. As evening approached, the crowd began to thin, but the energy remained. Small groups clustered together, making plans to meet again, exchanging phone numbers, taking on specific responsibilities. What had started as my private decision was becoming a genuine community undertaking. When only family remained, we sat on the porch in the gathering dusk. David had driven up from Minneapolis after all, still in his work clothes but looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. "Mom," Jennifer said quietly, "I owe you an apology. When you announced your plan yesterday, I thought you were making a mistake driven by emotion. But watching everyone today, seeing how this has brought people together already, I was wrong." "You weren't wrong to be concerned," I replied. "But you were wrong to assume I hadn't thought this through." David shifted in his chair. "Can I ask you something? When did you start planning all this? Really planning it, I mean." I thought back to those long nights sitting by Robert's hospital bed, holding his hand while he drifted in and out of consciousness. The conversations we'd had about legacy, about what matters, about how the things we build should outlast us. "The day your father died," I answered honestly. "When I came home to this empty house and realized it wasn't empty at all. It was full of everything we'd built together, and I couldn't bear the thought of it becoming just another real estate transaction." Sharon pulled her laptop from her bag. "Well, it definitely won't be that. Look at this." She turned the screen toward us, showing a simple website she'd built that afternoon. Thompson House Community Center. "I've already had 12 organizations reach out about partnerships. The food bank wants to use the kitchen for their cooking classes. The library is interested in hosting after-school tutoring. Even the community college asked about using the space for some of their certification programs." As we talked, I found myself watching my children with new eyes. Not as the adults who'd tried to manage my grief and make decisions for me, but as the capable, caring people they'd become. Somehow, in transforming my house into something bigger than itself, I'd also transformed our relationship back into something resembling the closeness we'd once shared. The streetlights flickered on one by one as we sat there, planning and dreaming, and occasionally falling into comfortable silence. At one point, a car slowed as it passed, the driver waving. Then another, and another. Word was spreading that something special was happening at the Thompson house. "Mom," David finally said as we prepared to go inside, "I'm sorry we underestimated you." "You didn't underestimate me," I corrected gently. "You forgot to ask me what I wanted. That's different." "And to be fair, I forgot to tell you." Jennifer hugged me goodnight, whispering, "Thank you for reminding us that you're still our mom who builds adventures, not just the grieving widow who needs protection." After they left, I walked through the house one more time. Tomorrow would bring more papers to sign, more people to coordinate with, more decisions to make. But tonight, I allowed myself a quiet moment of satisfaction. The house felt different already, not because anything physical had changed, but because its purpose had shifted. In the kitchen, I made my evening tea and sat at the table where I'd eaten thousands of meals, helped with countless homework assignments, and celebrated every milestone my children had achieved. Tomorrow, other families would start making their own memories here, and somehow that thought filled me with more peace than sadness. I opened my journal, something I'd started doing in the weeks after Robert's death, and began writing. Day 1 of the house's new life. Sometimes the biggest. Changes start with the smallest rebellions. I refuse to be managed like an asset instead of treated like a person. I refuse to let grief be the only force shaping my future. And in refusing, I discovered that the story of our house isn't ending. It's evolving into something richer than I could have imagined. Robert would have loved today. Not just the planning and the community response, but the moment when our children stopped seeing me as someone who needed saving and started seeing me as someone who had already found her own way forward. That's the real gift in all of this. Not just giving back to the community, but giving my family permission to see that strength and wisdom don't disappear with age and loss. They just transform, like everything else. Tomorrow, we start the actual work. Tonight, I'm content knowing that sometimes the best way to honor the past is to imagine a future that's even better. I closed the journal and turned off the kitchen light, climbing the stairs to the bedroom that would soon house a family in transition. Through the window, I could see the moon rising over Cedar Falls, casting silver light on the ordinary houses that lined Maple Street. Ordinary houses, like mine had been, before it became something more. But then again, maybe there are no ordinary houses, only ordinary ways of seeing them. Maybe every home has the potential to become something that serves beyond itself, if only we're brave enough to imagine it. As I drifted off to sleep, I heard the house settling around me. But tonight, the creaks and sighs sounded different. Not like a building aging in solitude, but like a structure preparing for new life, new purpose, new beginnings. Morning would come with its challenges and possibilities. But for now, I rested easy knowing that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to accept other people's definition of your limitations and write your own story instead. The last thought I had before sleep claimed me was this: I'd spent 6 months learning how to live without Robert. Now I was learning how to live for something greater than myself. And somehow, I suspected Robert would say that was always the point. 3 weeks later, I found myself standing in front of dozens of community members at the Cedar Falls Town Hall, microphone in hand, officially launching what everyone was now calling the Thompson House Project. The transformation had been swift and sometimes overwhelming, but watching the diverse crowd, families, students, retirees, business owners, I knew we'd tapped into something that had been waiting to emerge. When I first decided to donate our family home to the community, I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected, I thought I was simply preventing a sale. I had no idea I was actually opening a door that so many people had been hoping to walk through. The auditorium was packed beyond capacity. The local paper had run a front-page story that week titled "Widow's Gift Sparks Community Renaissance," which felt like an exaggeration until I saw this turnout. People were standing in the aisles, sitting on the floor near the stage, and streaming the event from overflow rooms. Samuel Chen stood beside me, looking both proud and slightly overwhelmed by the attention. "In less than a month," he announced, "we've received commitments for over $50,000 in materials and labor donations. 17 local businesses have pledged ongoing support. And most remarkably, we have 127 volunteers registered for different aspects of the renovation and programming." A ripple of applause swept through the crowd. I caught Helena's eye in the third row. She was wiping away tears again. Next to her sat Mrs. Miller with a group of other seniors from the neighborhood, all wearing matching t-shirts that read, "Thompson House Angels," which they'd designed themselves. The real work had begun 2 weeks ago when the city finally approved all our permits. What happened next still amazed me. Instead of hiring one large contractor, we'd somehow created a community, barn-raising atmosphere, where expertise and effort flowed naturally. Retired tradespeople worked alongside eager teenagers. Stay-at-home parents coordinated with working professionals. Everyone found their place in the process. Dr. Patricia Rodriguez, a social worker who specialized in trauma-informed housing, took the microphone next. What makes the Thompson House model unique isn't just its physical transformation. It's the collaborative approach to creating truly supportive transitional housing. Every family who enters the program will have wraparound services, job placement assistance, childcare, financial counseling, mental health support, all coordinated through partnerships with existing community resources. As she spoke, I thought about the Miller family who would be our first residents. Janet Miller had lost her job when the textile plant closed. Her husband was battling cancer, and they had 3 children under 10. When their landlord raised the rent beyond their means, they'd been facing homelessness. Now they would spend the next 6 months in our converted upstairs apartment while getting back on their feet. The real innovation here, Dr. Rodriguez continued, is how this emerged organically from the community rather than being imposed from outside. Bottom-up initiatives have shown much higher success rates in creating lasting change. After the Presentation, the crowd moved to the high school cafeteria for a working dinner. Tables were set up for different committees: renovation, programming, fundraising, volunteer coordination. The energy was palpable as people moved between tables, signing up, sharing ideas, beginning projects. I ended up at the curriculum development table, where Jennifer was leading a discussion with several educators about creating life skills workshops. My youngest daughter had completely thrown herself into this project, taking time off from her marketing job to coordinate the social media campaign and community outreach. "Mom," she called out, gesturing me over, "I want you to meet Dr. Kim Lee. She teaches at the community college and has some incredible ideas about vocational training partnerships." Dr. Lee was an energetic woman in her 40s who specialized in adult education. "Mrs. Thompson, we're exploring the possibility of offering certificate programs right here in your house. Basic computer literacy, food safety certification, childcare, training, all things that can lead directly to employment opportunities." As I listened to her outline the possibilities, my phone buzzed with a text from Sharon. "Mom, foundation response is insane. 3 more grants approved today. We're over our first-year funding goal already." The pace of change felt almost surreal. Sharon had returned to her old law firm roots, leveraging connections I didn't even know she had to secure funding and navigate regulatory requirements. David had formed a maintenance and sustainability team, creating detailed plans for everything from energy efficiency upgrades to long-term structural maintenance. He'd even convinced his company to donate smart home technology for monitoring utilities and security. Watching my children operate in their areas of expertise, coordinating with community members, I felt a complicated surge of emotions. Pride, certainly. Surprise at how quickly they'd moved from resistance to ownership of this vision. But also, something deeper, a recognition that in letting go of my house in the traditional sense, I'd found a way to bring my family together around a shared purpose in a way that hadn't happened since Robert's death. At the volunteer table, I noticed Curtis Wilson, a teenager I recognized from church, looking uncertain as he filled out forms. I walked over and sat beside him. "Hi, Curtis. You interested in helping out?" He nodded shyly. "My mom. She says what you're doing is real brave. We lived in transitional housing when I was little, before she got her nursing degree. I just thought maybe I could help other kids who, go through that." I squeezed his shoulder. "Would you be interested in organizing activities for the children who'll be staying with us? Maybe creating a buddy system for kids their first week here?" His face lit up. "Really? I mean, yeah, I'd love that." These moments kept happening. Strangers sharing personal stories, revealing needs I'd never imagined, offering resources I didn't know existed in our community. The project was becoming a mirror, reflecting both struggles and strengths that had been invisible to me before. Close to 9 o'clock, as the event was winding down, Michael Davis approached my table. The real estate agent who'd been so ready to list my house just weeks ago now wore an expression that mixed embarrassment with admiration. "Mrs. Thompson," he began awkwardly, "I have to admit, when your children first contacted me, I saw nothing but dollar signs. I never imagined, well, this." I gestured for him to sit. "Michael, you were doing your job. No hard feelings." He shook his head. "No, it's more than that. You've taught me something. I've been in real estate for 15 years, and I've never seen property create this kind of value. Not monetary value, but actual community value. You've got me rethinking how I approach every client now." We talked for another 20 minutes about how other families might be inspired to consider similar approaches to aging homes or inherited properties. By the time he left, he was genuinely interested in becoming an advisor for the project, helping identify other potential properties that could serve the community in creative ways. Around 10, only the core team remained, sitting in a circle with cups of decaf coffee and the remnants of Mrs. Miller's famous cookies. Helena, Samuel, my 3 children, Emma Rodriguez, and a handful of others who'd emerged as natural leaders in the past weeks. "I think we need to talk about something," Sharon said, ever the practical organizer. "Mom, you're still talking about moving into that small apartment downstairs. But looking at everything that's happening here, everything you're going to be coordinating, I think you need more space. This is your project, your vision. You shouldn't be cramped into a studio apartment while managing it all." I started to protest, but David cut in. "Sharon's right, Mom. We've been talking about this. The house has to be for the community, but you're the heart of the community side of it. There's a difference." Jennifer pulled out her tablet, showing architectural drawings I hadn't seen before. "What if we modify the plan slightly? The downstairs apartment expands to include Dad's old office. Still completely separate from the transitional housing units, but giving you enough space to actually live, not just exist." Looking at their faces, earnest, concerned but not patronizing, I felt something shift in my understanding of what was happening here. They weren't trying to control or manage me. They were seeing me clearly for the first time in months and responding to what they observed. "When did you three become such a team?" I asked, touched. Jennifer grinned. "When we realized our mother was secretly planning a revolution while we were arguing about real estate values," Emma laughed. "For what it's worth, I agree with them, Maggie. This project needs leadership continuity. If you burn out because you're living in a shoebox, who takes over? You're not just the founder, you're the institutional memory." The conversation continued for another hour, reshaping plans, adjusting visions, strengthening the framework of what we were building. By the time everyone left, I was exhausted but exhilarated. The house would be transformed, the community would be served, and somehow, through it all, I wouldn't lose myself in martyrdom, but find a sustainable way to contribute. That night, alone in the house that was no longer quite mine, but not yet, fully the community's, I received an unexpected phone call. The number was local but unfamiliar. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Claire Brennan from Channel 6 News. We're interested in doing a feature segment on the Thompson House project. Would you be available for an interview tomorrow?" After I hung up, I sat for a long time in Robert's chair, thinking about how far things had traveled from that Sunday afternoon when my children tried to sell my life out from under me. The local news wanted to interview me. The community was building something unprecedented. My children were working together like they hadn't since they were teenagers, sharing summer jobs. I walked through the house, imagining tomorrow's camera, crew capturing rooms that were already in transition. The dining room where workers had begun installing modular furniture for the computer training lab. The sun porch where yoga mats were being donated for wellness classes. The basement where David's team was creating a soundproof study space for residents. In the kitchen, I made my evening tea and opened my laptop. Emails had piled up. Partnerships proposals, volunteer applications, requests for consultations, from other communities interested in replicating the model. I answered a few, flagged others for follow-up, and then opened a new document. "Community meeting notes," I typed. "To-do list for tomorrow's interview. 1. Emphasize collective effort, not individual story. 2. Highlight successful partnerships already forming. 3. Frame this as beginning, not accomplishment." But my mind drifted from practical preparations to something more personal. I opened a new email and began typing. "Dear Robert," I wrote, then paused, surprised by the impulse. I hadn't written to him since the first weeks after his death. "I know you can't read this, but I need to tell you something. Remember how you always said our house had good bones? You meant structurally, but I think you knew it was about more than that. The foundation we built here, not just concrete and wood, but trust and openness and the belief that home should be about gathering, not isolation. It's holding everything else up now. The kids are different. Not the squabbling adults who came here 3 weeks ago with spreadsheets and pity, but the creative problem solvers we raised them to be. Sharon's using her law background to build something instead of just defending. Corporations. David's engineering mind is solving real problems for real families. Jennifer's marketing skills are telling stories that inspire people to action instead of just selling products. And me? I'm not just the widow in the big house anymore. I'm not even just the woman who donated property to charity. I'm becoming something I didn't expect. A facilitator, a connector, someone who helps other people discover what they're capable of contributing. You would love the chaos of it. The teenagers painting murals on the garage walls under Emma's direction. Helena turning the side yard into a learning garden with help from the high school's environmental club. Mrs. Miller teaching a weekly cooking class for families in transition, using your grandmother's recipes that she somehow remembered from that potluck we had years ago. But most of all, you'd love how alive the house feels again. Not with just our memories, but with the sounds of people building something together. Hammers and laughter and planning sessions that run too late. Children's drawings taped to walls that are getting new paint. The smell of fresh coffee always brewing because someone's always arriving or leaving with new ideas. I know you worried about me those last days, about whether I'd know how to be alone, how to make decisions without running them by you first, how to stand up for what I believed in when the path wasn't clear. I think I'm figuring it out. Not by being alone, as it turns out, but by learning how to be alone within community. There's a difference. I still miss you every day. But now it's a different kind of missing. Not the sharp ache of recent loss, but the gentle wish that you could see what's growing from the life we planted together. Tomorrow, when the cameras come, they'll ask about inspiration and motivation. They'll want a neat story about grief transformed into giving. But the real story is messier and more beautiful than that. It's about recognizing that home isn't something you own or even preserve. It's something you keep creating, keep sharing, keep expanding to hold whatever love and need and effort people bring to it. I hope I tell it right. I hope I help people see that any house can become a home for many if we stop thinking of security as walls we build to keep others out and start thinking of it as bridges we build to invite them in. Thank you for 32 years of practicing that with me. Watch what happens next. All my love, Maggie. I closed the laptop without sending the email. There was no address for it anyway. But writing it had clarified something important. Tomorrow's interview wasn't about me or my story. It was about showcasing a template for what becomes possible when private spaces transform into public good. I climbed the stairs, listening to the familiar creaks that now seemed to whisper promises of feet that would soon follow. Families finding their footing, children discovering new playmates, adults learning skills that would change their trajectories. The bedroom felt different tonight. Not like a room I was preparing to leave, but like a space in transition, preparing for its next incarnation. The same could be said for me, I realized. We were all in transition. The house, the community, my family, me. The difference was that now we were choosing the direction of change instead of having it chosen for us. I fell asleep thinking about Claire Brennan's questions tomorrow, about the other families who might be watching, considering their own inherited houses and aging parents, wondering if there might be a third option between selling out and holding on, wondering if home could be both deeply personal and broadly shared. Morning would bring the bright lights of cameras and the careful construction of sound bites. But tonight, in the quiet of a house preparing for its next chapter, I felt only gratitude for stubborn children who'd pushed back just hard enough to make me push forward. For a community that was more ready for this than any of us had realized. For Robert, who'd built something sturdy enough to be shared and flexible enough to grow. And for the strange, circuitous route from grief to purpose, which had taught me that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is refuse to be reduced to your loss and instead become someone who multiplies possibility for others. The house settled around me one more time, but now I heard it differently, not as the sound of aging infrastructure, but as a building taking a deep breath before its next great adventure. just like me. The morning of the television interview, I woke before dawn to find my kitchen transformed into command central. Jennifer had apparently arrived at some point during the night and covered my table with promotional materials, speaking notes, and what appeared to be an entire visual presentation on her laptop. "Morning, Mom," she called from the laundry room, where she was steaming a jacket I didn't even know I owned. "Claire called yesterday evening to update the interview parameters. They want to film both in the studio and here at the house. I've coordinated with the construction crews to pause work in the main areas between 9 and noon. I poured coffee, marveling at how naturally Jennifer had stepped into a role that blended her marketing expertise with genuine passion for the project. "How early did you get here?" "About 5. David's been texting since 4:30 about the weather. Looks like we'll have perfect lighting for the outdoor shots." She emerged with the jacket, holding it up for inspection. This color works with the house's exterior. Soft authority without overwhelming the message. It struck me how my children had unconsciously divided responsibilities based on their strengths. Sharon handled legal and administrative frameworks, David managed the physical infrastructure and maintenance systems, and Jennifer orchestrated communications and public relations. They'd found their roles without formal assignment, working together with an efficiency that reminded me of the early years when they'd naturally coordinate to achieve shared goals like convincing us to get a dog or extend summer vacation. By 8 o'clock, the house was bustling with quiet activity. Emma Rodriguez had arrived with her beautification crew, volunteers who'd spent weeks preparing presentation-ready spaces. The computer lab was arranged to photograph well, with gleaming new monitors and comfortable seating. The community kitchen sparkled, with fresh flowers and a bulletin board showcasing workshop schedules. Even the courtyard had been transformed with strategic plantings and welcoming signage. "Maggie," Emma whispered, adjusting a vase of sunflowers on the interview table. "Breathe. You've been living this every day. Just let that authentic energy come through." Helena arrived just as the news van pulled up, carrying a thermos of chamomile. "Tea for your voice," she said firmly, pressing it into my hands. "And remember, this isn't about you proving anything. It's about sharing what we're all building together." The crew was professional and efficient, but I could see they were surprised by the activity level. While they set up equipment, residents and volunteers moved naturally through spaces, creating an authentic representation of the house in use, rather than just empty rooms being showcased. Claire Brennan was younger than I'd expected, with an energy that suggested genuine curiosity rather than just checking boxes for a feel-good segment. After initial pleasantries, she asked to walk through the house informally before filming, wanting to understand the flow of activities. "Mrs. Thompson," she said as we paused in the main hallway, "what strikes me most is how organic this feels. Most community initiatives feel institutional. This feels more like evolution." "That's exactly it," I responded, surprised by how clearly the words came. "We're not replacing something that existed before. We're expanding what was already here. The community connections, the shared resources, the understanding that neighbors support neighbors. We're just making it visible and systematic." As we toured, she took particular interest in areas where different generations and backgrounds were naturally intersecting. In the computer lab, a retired accountant was teaching spreadsheet basics to a young mother who needed office skills for job applications. The community kitchen hosted both a support group for family caregivers and children decorating cookies for a school fundraiser. These weren't staged interactions. They were happening spontaneously because the space invited them. "This is what I want to capture," Claire said, her cameraman nodding in agreement. "The authenticity of multiple needs being met in one physical space without conflict." When we began the formal interview, she surprised me with her first question. Many people would see donating a valuable asset as the end of their security. How did you reframe it as the beginning of something larger? I thought about how to articulate something that had been more intuitive than calculated. Security isn't just financial. It's not even primarily financial. Real security comes from knowing you're connected to something larger than yourself, that your existence creates value for others. When my children were young, their security came from knowing this house was their foundation. Now different families need that same foundation. The house hasn't lost its purpose, it's expanded it. Her questions continued for nearly an hour, but the conversation felt more like a thoughtful exchange than an interview. She was particularly interested in how the project had revealed hidden community resources and capabilities. What we've discovered, I explained, choosing words carefully, is that our community was already full of people wanting to contribute but lacking structures to do so effectively. The Thompson House has become a coordinating point for existing goodwill. After the interior portion, we moved outside where the camera captured the visual transformation while I spoke with various volunteers. Janet Miller, our first transitional resident, agreed to be interviewed about her family's experience. "We feared the worst when we lost our housing," Janet said, her 3 children playing nearby under supervision from Curtis Wilson and other youth volunteers. "But finding this opportunity, it's not charity, it's community. My husband starts radiation treatment next week, and knowing we have stable housing with childcare support means I can focus on his care instead of worrying about where we'll sleep." The cameraman captured children's laughter mixing with the sounds of construction, showing the house as a living ecosystem rather than just a building being renovated. Claire interviewed David about the technical aspects of adaptive reuse, and Sharon about the legal frameworks enabling such innovative community partnerships. Perhaps the most powerful moment came when Michael Davis, my former real estate agent, spoke candidly about how the project had changed his professional perspective. "I've appraised thousands of properties," he told the camera, standing in the main living room. "But I've never seen one create this kind of exponential community value. It's made me question our entire framework for measuring worth." By noon, the official filming was complete, but Claire asked to stay for the weekly community lunch, a potluck tradition that had emerged organically as neighbors brought food to share with volunteers and residents. Her cameraman captured the informal interactions, the problem-solving conversations that happened between neighbors over sandwiches, the way children helped elderly residents navigate new technology while adults compared notes on job search strategies. "This is remarkable," Claire said during a quiet moment. "You've essentially created a functioning model of intergenerational, cross-socioeconomic community support. How do you maintain this momentum?" Before I could answer, Jennifer appeared, at my elbow with her tablet. "Sorry to interrupt, but we've got 2 more media requests and 3 inquiries from communities in other states asking for consultations. Plus, the State Housing Authority wants to schedule a visit to evaluate our model for potential policy recommendations." I turned back to Claire, feeling slightly overwhelmed. "I suppose the answer is that momentum maintains itself when something meets genuine needs. We're not pushing an agenda. We're responding to what people tell us they need and mobilizing resources to address those needs." After the news crew departed, I found myself in the kitchen with my 3 children, all of us, slightly stunned by the pace of growth. Sharon was scheduling phone calls with legislators who'd heard about the project. David was fielding calls from contractors in other states wanting to replicate the renovation approach. Jennifer was managing social media messages from nonprofits, hoping to establish similar initiatives. "I think we need to talk about scaling," David said, running calculations on his laptop. "Not scaling up the Thompson House itself, but creating systems for other communities to adapt this model. The interest is clearly there." Sharon nodded thoughtfully. "I've had 3 law school classmates reach out about their elderly parents facing similar situations. The Thompson House could become a template for how communities address both housing instability and underutilized residential property. But we have to maintain quality," I insisted. "This works because it's organic, responsive to actual needs, rather than imposed ideals. How do we bottle that?" Jennifer had been quiet, typing rapidly on her phone. "What if we don't bottle it? What if we create open-source resources? blueprints, legal frameworks, communication strategies, but emphasized that each community needs to develop its own variation based on local conditions and needs. We spent the afternoon in that kitchen, occasionally interrupted by volunteers or residents stopping by, sketching out possibilities for something none of us had anticipated when this began. The Thompson House project was becoming a movement, a proof of concept that was inspiring replication far beyond Cedar Falls. Late in the afternoon, as natural light slanted through western windows, Emma Rodriguez found me in Robert's old office, where I'd retreated to process the day's developments. "You're hiding," she observed accurately, settling into the opposite chair. "I'm recalibrating," I corrected, gesturing to the photographs scattered across the desk, before and after shots of various house renovations she'd compiled. "Emma, when I decided not to sell this house, I never imagined it would become this." She studied me with the directness I'd come to expect from her. "Would you rather it hadn't?" The question caught me off guard. Would I prefer the simpler version where I'd quietly kept the house, lived alone with memories, maybe hosted occasional gatherings, where my children returned to their distant, dutiful check-ins, where the community's needs remained invisible and unaddressed? "No," I answered firmly. "But sometimes the scope of what we've started feels overwhelming. All these eyes watching, all these people counting on this to succeed, all these communities hoping to replicate something we're still figuring out ourselves." Emma leaned forward. "You know what I see when I look at you? Not someone overwhelmed by success, but someone who's always carried this vision and is finally seeing others share it. The difference is that now you don't have to carry it alone." Her words resonated with something I'd been trying to articulate to myself. The weight I felt wasn't burden. It was the unfamiliar sensation of shared responsibility. For months after Robert's death, I'd been alone with every decision, every plan, every fear about the future. Now, suddenly, dozens of capable people were invested in this vision I'd initiated. That evening, the house hummed with evening activities. A yoga class in the sun porch attracted an intergenerational mix. The computer lab hosted a job interview preparation workshop. Children did homework in the reading nook while parents attended. Financial literacy training in the converted dining room. I moved through spaces hearing multiple languages, seeing various abilities and backgrounds intersecting naturally. In my apartment, expanded as my children had insisted, I found a package at my door. No return address, just a local postmark. Inside was a hand-bound photo album with a note. "From all the families at Willowbrook Apartments, you'll never know how much your example means to us." The album contained photographs of 6 families who'd been inspired by news coverage to approach their landlord about converting their apartment complex's unused community room into a shared resource space. The final photo showed a ribbon-cutting ceremony with a sign reading, "Willowbrook Community Hub, inspired by Thompson House." I sank into the couch, flipping through images of strangers who'd taken our experiment and made it their own. This was what duplication looked like. Not exact replication, but adaptation to local circumstances and needs. Each photo showed people discovering their own capacity for collective problem-solving. My phone rang, Sharon calling with her evening update. "Mom, I just finished a conference call with housing policy researchers from 3 universities. They want to study our model formally, not just the structure, but the social dynamics that make it work." "What did you tell them?" "That they're welcome to observe, but our first priority is serving our community, not being subjects for academic study." They actually appreciated that boundary. She paused. "Mom, are you okay? You've been quiet since the interview." I stretched, out on the couch, thinking about how to explain the strange mix of pride and uncertainty I was experiencing. I'm processing the difference between starting something and sustaining it, between being Margaret Thompson, who made an unexpected choice, and becoming some kind of symbol for community innovation. "You're still just Mom," Sharon said gently. You're just mom who happened to trust her instincts and inspire a bunch of other people to trust theirs too. That doesn't change who you are. After we hung up, I made herbal tea and settled at my desk to check emails. Mixed with the congratulations and consultation requests were messages that reminded me why this mattered. A single mother describing how our model had helped her negotiate better conditions with her landlord. An elderly man who'd convinced his homeowners association to convert a vacant lot into a community workshop space. A teenager who'd started organizing neighborhood skill-sharing circles after watching our local news coverage. That night, unable to sleep despite exhaustion, I found myself in the kitchen with my journal. Outside, Cedar Falls was quiet, but I could hear the gentle sounds of other people living in spaces that had once been mine alone. It felt strange, but not lonely. Crowded, but not invasive. Shared, but not diminished. Day 23 of the new era, I wrote, smiling at the grandiosity of the phrase. The house breathes differently now, with purpose multiplied by however many people pass through each day. Strange to think that a month ago, I was defending my right to make decisions about my own future. Now people across the country are asking how to apply those decisions to their own circumstances. Claire Brennan asked if I felt pressure to succeed. The truth is more complicated. I feel responsibility to the families using these resources, to the community members volunteering their time, to the children drawing pictures for our walls. But I also feel supported in ways I never expected. Robert used to say that the strongest structures had redundant support systems. This project has become that. No single person is essential because everyone is essential, including me, including not me. I think what surprises me most is how organic the growth has been. We didn't create a program and impose it on people. We created space and let people tell us what they needed. That's why it's working. That's why it's spreading. Not because we had all the answers, but because we asked the right questions. What do you need? What can you offer? How can we connect those things? Tomorrow brings more interviews, more plans, more people looking to us for guidance about creating similar spaces in their communities. I hope I remember to tell them what I'm finally understanding myself. The magic isn't in the specific structure or even the generous gesture. It's in the willingness to see your private resources as potential public good and to trust your community to help shape that potential into reality. I closed the journal and walked through the quiet house, checking locks and turning off lights, a routine that had once felt like securing an empty fortress, but now felt like tidying a well-used space for tomorrow's activities. In each room, evidence of the day's life remained. A child's forgotten sweater in the reading corner, notes on whiteboards from planning meetings, clean coffee cups waiting for morning use. In the hallway, I paused at the family photo wall I'd never quite managed to update since Robert's death. The photos ended abruptly in recent years, as if life had stopped evolving. Now I realized what needed to happen. Not removal of old memories, but expansion of the wall to include new ones. Pictures of this house's second act, of the community it was becoming, of the ways family could extend beyond blood relation to include everyone who contributed to a shared home. Standing there in the hallway that connected then and now, private, and public, individual, and community, I felt something shift in my understanding of what I'd really done these past months. I hadn't just saved a house or helped a community. I'd found a way to continue growing, continue building, continue creating, despite loss, despite fear, despite everyone else's expectations about who I should become. The house settled around me with its familiar nighttime sounds, but now I heard them as a chorus rather than a solo. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new growth, new people contributing their voices to this evolving song. For now, though, I was content to listen to what we'd created together. A home that had learned to multiply rather than divide its love, space that had discovered how to expand by sharing, and a community that had always existed, but finally had a framework for flourishing together. 6 months later, I stood in the living room of what people now called the original Thompson house, watching a documentary crew capture the daily rhythm of life that had become so natural, I sometimes forgot how extraordinary it was. The November afternoon light filtered through curtains Jennifer had installed. Practical, washable, but still beautiful, casting warm squares across the floor where children were building block towers while their parents attended job training in the basement. The documentary was different from the earlier news coverage, titled Houses of Community, the Thompson Movement. It wasn't just about one house in Cedar Falls anymore, but about the 47 similar projects that had emerged across 12 states in the months since our story gained national attention. Today, they were filming what they called the Daily Miracle, the seamless integration of transitional housing, educational programs, and community connection that had evolved from that original impulse to simply not sell. "Mrs. Thompson," the director asked during a scheduled break, "when you look at what began here and see it replicated in places like Detroit, rural Mississippi, and suburban Portland, what do you think?" I settled into the armchair, Robert's old chair, still positioned perfectly for conversation, and considered the question carefully. I think human beings have an innate capacity for creativity and generosity when given the right framework. We didn't invent community care. We just made visible something that was already there, waiting for permission to emerge. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of verification, followed by validation. The State Housing Authority had conducted their evaluation, concluding that the Thompson House model demonstrated unprecedented efficacy in combining transitional housing with skill development and community integration. The university researchers, Sharon had mentioned, completed their social impact study, documenting measurable improvements in resident outcomes, volunteer engagement, and neighborhood cohesion. But the real success stories weren't captured in those reports. They lived in moments like watching 15-year-old Curtis Wilson teach computer basics to 67-year-old Mrs. Patterson, both of them laughing at a shared mistake. Or Janet Miller, our first resident, now volunteering as a peer navigator for new families while her husband completed cancer treatment in remission. Or the spontaneous Sunday dinners where everyone contributed something to the table and nobody tracked who brought what. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Mom, that foundation in Boston approved our request. We're officially funded to develop the Thompson House Toolkit, complete resources for communities wanting to start their own projects." I showed the message to the director, who nodded with satisfaction. "That's exactly what I want to explore today. How do you codify something that works because it's organic and responsive?" We moved to the kitchen for the next segment, where Emma Rodriguez was leading a cooking class that doubled as English language practice for 2 recent immigrant families. The space buzzed with conversation in 3 languages, while the scent of various cuisines mingled, a sensory reminder of how beautifully complexity could function when trust provided the foundation. "The toolkit isn't a blueprint," I explained to the camera. "It's more like a framework that communities can adapt. Core principles about inclusive decision-making, flexible space use, volunteer coordination, but the specifics have to emerge from each community's unique dynamics and needs." As if on cue, my phone rang, the 4th call that week from community groups seeking consultation. While production paused, I took the call in the sun porch, which had become my unofficial office for these conversations. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Patricia Chen from Columbus, Ohio. Our neighborhood association wants to transform an abandoned Victorian into a community resource, inspired by your model. Can we schedule a consultation?" These calls no longer surprised me. After explaining our process and offering to connect her with Sarah Jenkins, our volunteer coordinator who managed these requests, I returned to find the documentary crew setting, up for interviews with residents and volunteers. They spoke with depth and nuance about their experiences, not just gratitude, but honest assessments of challenges and solutions. Maria Gonzalez, our legal advisor, had developed what she called gentle accountability frameworks, that maintained supportive boundaries without becoming punitive. Dr. Patricia. Rodriguez had created trauma-informed protocols that acknowledged residents' complex needs while fostering independence. The beauty of this model, Dr. Rodriguez told the camera, is that it doesn't require perfection from anyone, not from residents, rebuilding their lives, not from volunteers learning as they go, not from the founder who's human like everyone else. It requires commitment to growth and willingness to adapt when things don't work. Late in the afternoon, Helena knocked on my door, carrying a thick envelope. "Maggie, you need to see this before the crew finishes today." The return address read, National Foundation for Community Innovation. Inside was a formal invitation to serve on their board of directors, along with a letter recognizing the Thompson House model as transformative community architecture and requesting my keynote address at their annual summit in Washington, D.C. I handed the letter to Helena, who read it with widening eyes. "You're going national, Maggie. Actually, you already have, but now it's official." The documentary crew, initially scheduled to wrap by dinner, stayed through the evening meal, another spontaneous potluck where the dining room filled with 30 people from diverse backgrounds sharing food and stories. The cameraman captured natural scenes, teenagers helping elderly neighbors navigate smartphones, children playing while adults discussed everything from local politics to job prospects to recipe exchanges. During dessert, Sharon arrived with for news. 3 law schools had requested permission to use our legal frameworks as case studies for community law courses. The Harvard Business Review wanted to publish a retrospective on our model's impact on social entrepreneurship. Even the Department of Housing and Urban Development had reached out about featuring Thompson House in their National Best Practices database. "Mom," Jennifer whispered as we cleared dishes together, "are you ready for this level of recognition?" I looked around the dining room, where people were naturally forming small groups, continuing conversations, children helping load the dishwasher, someone starting a quiet sing-along in the living room. "The recognition isn't the point," I said carefully. "This is." I gestured to the scene around us. Everything else is just documentation of what happens when people are given space to be their best selves together. After the documentary crew left and most residents had retired for the evening, my 3 children and I sat in the living room. The house felt different in these quiet moments. Not emptier, but expectant, like it was resting between acts of a continuous play. "I need to tell you something," I began, holding the foundation's invitation. "This board position, it would mean travel, national visibility, speaking engagements, more time away from here." David leaned forward. "And you're worried about leaving?" "I'm worried about losing sight of why this started. This wasn't about building a model or changing housing policy. It was about keeping faith with your father's vision of what a house could mean to a community. About refusing to be reduced to someone else's definition of what I should do with my life." Sharon was quiet for a moment. "Mom, what if accepting national recognition is exactly how you keep faith with Dad's vision? You're not abandoning this house or this community. You're amplifying what works here so more communities can benefit." Jennifer pulled out her tablet, showing me the social media analytics that had become her specialty. "Look at this. Every time you share our story authentically, without trying to make it sound perfect or prescriptive, people respond with their own innovations. You've created a conversation, not a franchise." We talked late into the night, finally reaching a decision I hadn't expected. I would accept the board position and speaking engagements, but with clear boundaries. The focus would always return to practical application, not theoretical frameworks. The house would remain my primary residence and commitment. Any travel would be balanced with time spent in our community, maintaining the hands-on engagement that kept this work grounded in reality. "Besides," David added with a grin, "someone needs to keep Janet Miller from completely taking over volunteer coordination. She's getting a little too efficient." We laughed, understanding that the teasing reflected deeper appreciation for how our initial residents had become invested stakeholders. Janet had indeed become such an integral volunteer coordinator that she was practically co-running the daily operations. Late that night, after everyone had left, I found myself in the kitchen writing in my journal, a practice that had evolved from processing grief to documenting unexpected discoveries. 6 months in, I wrote, or perhaps the beginning of the next chapter. Today, strangers called this house the original, as if it were historical rather than living. But history is made daily here, in small acts of inclusion, in spaces shared across difference, in problems solved collectively rather than individually. The documentary crew asked about legacy, about whether I'd envisioned this impact. The truth is simpler and more complex than that. I envisioned keeping a house full of memories while remaining open to new ones. Everything else has been collaborative. Creation. Not my vision alone, but what emerges when many people bring their hopes and skills to a shared space. Robert would be amused by all the attention, but proud of what we've built together. Not just the physical structure or the national movement, but the way our children have rediscovered how to work as a team. How neighbors have become extended family, how individual struggles have transformed into community strength. Tomorrow, I'll accept the Foundation's invitation, but not as someone who invented something new. As someone who simply refused to accept that loss meant stagnation, that widowhood meant invisibility, that an empty nest meant an empty life. Sometimes the most radical act is the one that feels most natural. Opening your hands instead of clenching them, expanding possibilities instead of limiting them, building bridges instead of walls. The house creaks tonight with the weight of 47 people sleeping within its walls, residents finding stability, volunteers sharing skills, children dreaming of tomorrow. Each sound tells a story different from but connected to the ones Robert and I created here for 32 years. The foundation remains the same. Home is what you make available to love, not what you protect from it. The documentarians wanted to capture the moment when a private house became public good. But I think the transformation has been more subtle and more profound. We've discovered that the boundaries between private and public, individual and community, loss and renewal are more permeable than we knew. When you shift from protecting what you have to expanding what's possible, extraordinary things emerge from ordinary choices. Next month, I'll speak at the Foundation Summit. I'll share what we've learned, knowing that each community will need to discover its own version of these truths. But I'll also return here, to this chair, this kitchen, this house that taught me that security isn't about controlling outcomes, but about building foundations strong enough to support whatever grows upon them. The real story isn't about a widow who donated her house. It's about what happens when we stop asking, how do I preserve what I have? And start asking, how do I multiply what's possible? The answer, it turns out, lies not in grand gestures, but in daily choices to share rather than hoard, to include rather than exclude, to trust the creative capacity of community to solve its own challenges when given the right framework. In 6 months, 47 communities have adapted our model, each creating something unique and locally responsive. In 60 years, who knows what this ripple might touch? For now, I'm content knowing that tomorrow will bring new challenges and new collaborations, that this house will continue breathing with the rhythms of multiple lives, that the story continues to write itself through all of us who participate in its unfolding. I close the journal and move through the quiet house, checking locks and turning off lights. A routine now shared with night shift volunteers and overnight staff, but still somehow intimately mine. In my bedroom, expanded as my children had insisted. I paused at the window overlooking the backyard where early snow was beginning to fall. The community garden lay dormant for winter, but greenhouse frames David had designed promised year-round growing space come spring. The playground, equipment that had appeared through anonymous donation, gleamed softly under street lamps. Tomorrow's footprints would join countless others in the snow, each path representing another family's journey through transition, another volunteer's commitment, another child's discovery that safety and adventure could coexist in the same space. My phone screen lit with a final message for the day from a community organizer in rural Vermont. Mrs. Thompson, we converted our local Grange Hall using your model. 30 families housed this winter. Thank you for showing us it's possible. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I opened the window slightly, letting in the cold November air that carried the scent of snow and wood smoke, the distant sound of someone's television, a dog barking 3 houses down, the ordinary symphony of neighborhood life that had always existed, but somehow sounded richer now, more intentional, more connected. This was what success looked like, not the headlines or awards or invitations, but the quiet knowledge that private grief had been alchemized into public good, that one family's house had become a template for how many families might find shelter. That individual loss had revealed the abundance available when we stop guarding our resources and start sharing them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The board position with its expectations, speaking engagements with their requisite diplomacy, the ongoing delicate balance of maintaining local authenticity while engaging national attention. But tonight, in this house that had become so much more than its original purpose, I felt only gratitude. For stubborn children who'd pushed me to think bigger, for a community ready to grow together, for Robert, who'd built foundations strong enough to support whatever we chose to build upon them, and for the strange grace of discovering that the most personal losses can become the seeds of the most communal flourishing. That home multiplies rather than diminishes when shared, and that sometimes the best way to honor what's been lost is to remain wildly, generously open to everything still possible. The house settled around me one final time, its creaks and sighs now a lullaby sung in harmony by dozens of lives intertwining under one roof. Outside, Cedar Falls slept peacefully, unaware that tomorrow would bring new documentation of the miracle that begins when we choose connection over isolation, abundance over scarcity, community over commodity. But I knew. And as I drifted off to sleep, I carried the deep satisfaction of someone who had stumbled upon a truth so simple it had been hiding in plain sight. That every closed door holds the potential to become an open invitation. Every empty room waits to be filled with new life, and every ending insists on transforming itself into the first word of a story still being written. The last thought I had before sleep was of Robert, somewhere in the space between memory and presence, whispering what I knew he'd say if he could. Now, that's more like it, Maggie. That's exactly like it. Later, historians of social movements might trace the Thompson House phenomenon back to a single decision made by a grieving widow on a quiet Sunday afternoon. But they would miss the real beginning. The moment loss taught me that the opposite of holding tight isn't letting go, but opening wide enough to discover what's already there, waiting for permission to flourish. Future sociologists might analyze the structural elements that made our model replicable, the policy implications that emerged from grassroots innovation, the economic impacts of transforming private property into community resource. But they would miss the beating heart of it, the daily miracle of strangers becoming neighbors, of skills shared freely, of children playing while adults learn, of every meal becoming communion and every conversation becoming collaboration. Someday, visitors might tour the original Thompson House as a historical landmark, noting the adaptive architectural features, the inclusive design principles, the frameworks that balanced individual dignity with collective responsibility. But they would experience only the echo of what we created, the living, breathing organism of community that continues to evolve with each person who enters, contributes, and carries the possibility forward into their own life. The real legacy isn't in the concrete and wood, the programs and policies, the accolades and documentation. It lives in the permanent shift from asking, "What can I keep?" to wondering, "What becomes possible when we share?" It resides in the recognition that home isn't diminished by expanding its embrace, but infinitely multiplied. And if somewhere a Widow sits alone in an empty house too big for one person, wondering what comes next. I hope our story reaches her. Not as a blueprint to follow, but as evidence that the answer to loss might be found in the courage to open wider, trust deeper, and discover that what we feared to give away was always meant to become our greatest gift. The morning light would find me here again, ready for whatever chapter comes next, ready to speak to rooms full of policymakers and practitioners, always bringing the conversation back to the essential truth. That transformation begins not with grand theories, but with someone brave enough to ask, what if this space held more than just me? And in 47 communities and counting, people are discovering their own versions of that answer, writing new stories on the foundation we built not by knowing everything, but by remaining open to learning everything, together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.